The next speaker is Dr. Nicky Creux, and the title of her presentation is The Review of the 20th International Sunflower Conference with a special focus on pollination. Nicky, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hi everyone, as you heard, I'm Nicky. I'm from the University of Pretoria and FABI, and my research sits within the National Grain Research Program. And I was asked to talk a little bit today about what we saw at the International Sunflower Conference last year, and with a special focus on pollination, because that's where a large amount of my research is focused. So the International Sunflower Conference is actually the flagship event for the International Sunflower Association. This association was founded in 1902, so it's about 122 years old in France, and it includes members from all over the globe, with some of the major sunflower producing nations in the world. And the main aim of this society or association is to grow research development of sunflower and to improve international cooperation on the agronomic, technical, and nutritional levels. So this International Sunflower Conference happens every 4 years, but the 2020 event had to be moved to 2022 due to COVID. Worked for me because I could attend, which is nice. But it was held in Serbia, in Novi Sad, in June last year. It was fairly big, with about 400 participants. There were 9 keynote lectures. There were 74 oral presentations and about 80 poster presentations. And this was a really important forum for engagement for industry, government, and academic researchers to grow, develop collaborations and partnerships, and to further their sunflower research. And maybe just a little advert that the next conference is set to be held in China and in Mongolia in 2024. And if you'd like any information about that, please feel free to contact me at any time. So I'm going to start with the biggest highlight of the conference, and that also allows me to brag a little bit that my PhD student, my first PhD student, Fraser, actually won the second Best Poster Award at the conference. She was presenting her research on planting dates and the effect of environment on sunflower yield development and sclerotinia head rot progression. She's actually sitting here in the audience, so if you'd like to speak to her a little bit more, do you want to wave your hand? Everyone knows you are. About her work, please feel free. Okay, so there were 4 main themes at the conference. Of course, the first one was what we've just spoken about, was oil and global markets. And it was nice to hear that South Africa was labeled as one of the top 10 producers in the world, which is pretty nice. And at that time, when we went to the conference, the Ukraine war was on everybody's lips there. And it was quite interesting because there were researchers both from Ukraine and Russia at the conference, which made for interesting dinner conversation. Etienne Prelot gave a very nice overview of what the global standings were at that time. And he posed that with the war, there could have been a market loss if other alternative oils ended up being cheaper. As Fadi just presented, that wasn't the case. Everybody skyrocketed. That probably saved the sunflower market a little bit. And he also mentioned that with this decrease in production from Ukraine and Russia, there is opportunities for other nations to maybe step up and fill some of this gap in the future. Another interesting thing that I noticed was that several different countries, especially China, seem to be exploring confectionery sunflower, so sunflower for eating, as an emerging market. And that's probably something we need to keep an eye on in the future. So when you go to any agricultural conference, there will always be a theme on pests and pathogens. It's a part of life if you grow plants. And Dr. Leo Reyes from Spain, she gave a very nice talk on all the different efforts to try and find biological control agents against the major sunflower pests. And the highlighted ones were our friend Sclerotinia, verticillium wilt, downy mildew, and broom rape. And I was surprised, there were far fewer discussions on sclerotinia when we were over there, whereas here, it's pretty much the number one pest we talk about at the moment, especially over the last 2 years. And their focus was much more strongly on controlling broom rape and downy mildew. And I think it's something we need to keep in mind because breeders in that side of the world are likely to start moving away from sclerotinia breeding in preference for some of these other pests and pathogens, and something we need to think about ourselves. So I found the broom rape story quite interesting, and, oh, is it not? It doesn't want to. Oh, okay, great. I found the broom rape story quite interesting, and Dr. Muniz from INRA in France had a discussion about how it's spread across the globe recently, and they noticed that there is now incidences of broom rape in North Africa, and so it's something we need to keep an eye out for in the future, as it may start marching down. So what is broom rape? It's a parasitic plant, similar to striga or witchweed on maize, and it's something that we do need to just keep an eye out for and make sure our borders are protected against something like this in the future. So the next theme was on sunflower breeding. There was a lot of talk about sunflower breeding, and we were really lucky to have Dr. Felicity Veer from INRA present her life's work on sunflower breeding. And she did a really beautiful job of explaining the different goals, the goals for oil increase, yield increase, but she also highlighted some new avenues that we need to be focused on in breeding in the future, including pollination, predation, and abiotic stress factors. And these are somewhat more difficult to control. So there was also some discussion about how we need to protect our biodiversity, especially in the wild relatives of some of our main crop species. And the reason for this is that some of the wild relatives will have genetics that are more hardy, more resilient to climate. And these traits could be rebrought in to cultivars to help boost the genetics we already have. And in terms of that, Dr. Langlade, who is also at INRA France, presented their work on the Sunrise Project. This project is a big genetic survey where they were looking at diversity in sunflower across Europe and trying to identify key factors that are resilient to abiotic stresses. We were lucky at FABI at UP to have Dr. Langlade present an international seminar for us, and you can actually go and have a look at his talk on our FABI YouTube channel if you would like to see more details on that talk as well. Okay, so the last main theme was obviously improving yield, because that's what most of us are interested in. And there was a lot of talk about pollination and how pollination and also different agronomic practices are important for boosting yield. So with pollination, we know pollination can be quite sensitive to abiotic stress factors, so we discussed that a lot. And one of the things that was highlighted several times is that even though many sunflower cultivars are selfing, they can produce seed by themselves, they don't need an insect pollinator, there have been many studies to show that if you have pollination in your field, you will have increased yields. And so it's important to understand how pollination is working under these systems. And then Dr. De Beck from INRA also discussed how we could possibly consider shifting planting dates or growing regions to maintain sunflower production in the future under climate change. And he suggested more sustainable options if we explore double cropping systems or agroforestry, but many of these are also Europe-centric, right? So that's where the basic overview. I did a small write-up for the September issue of the oilseeds focus, so you can also have a look at that if you want some more of the details that I presented today. So the rest of my time, I want to talk a little bit about the work I presented at the International Sunflower Conference. Thank you very much for the award that I received. I'm lucky I decided to include that paper's research today. So this is really about a delicate balancing act of climate control for flowering, pollination, and seed development. So when you think about cross-pollination, it's quite a coordinating feat for a plant. You need fertile pollen ready at the same time that you need the flower to be receptive to that pollen. And very often that has to happen in 2 different flowers or even 2 different plants. And then this also needs to happen at the same time that the flower's pollinator of choice is active. To make things a little bit more interesting, environmental factors such as wind, humidity, temperature, or light can alter the behavior of pollinators and flowers. So what are the factors that cause poor pollination with abiotic stress? Well, temperature is one of the driving forces. So if it's too hot, you can have reduced pollen quality, poor pollen germination, failure of pollen-pistil interaction, and many other factors. Also, if it's too cold, so if you flower too late, you can have similar decreases in pollination. So plants have actually evolved a number of strategies to try and maintain their floral temperature, because producing seed, for us, it's yield, but for a plant, it's survival of its species. And so they have developed a number of different ways of maintaining this. This can include shape, position of the flower, color, orientation, or even opening and closing of the flowers. So what actually happens in sunflowers in terms of how do they monitor and maintain their temperature? So we all know that sunflowers, when they're juveniles, before they flower, they can track the sun from east to west. And this helps them accumulate biomass and maintain their yield through time. A very interesting note was that at night, without any other light cues, the sunflowers will redirect back to the east, ready for the following dawn. And this was one of the first clues they found in the Atamian paper, where they saw that actually the plant's internal clock is guiding it on when to turn back to the east. And as the plant matures, it strongly turns back east every day, but it turns to the west slower. And so eventually when they flower, they remain facing east. I'm sure most of you have seen that in your fields. And so our question became, well, what is the relevance of facing east? Is this how it maintains its core temperatures and it maintains its seed production? And that's really where my postdoc at the University of California in Davis started, was the question, what is the relevance of having this easterly orientation? So I went into the field, looked very different from your fields. I grew plants in pots, and when they had finished tracking, I turned half of them to face west. I then counted insect visits, measured temperature, time-lapse photography, measured temperature, and I also artificially heated some plants in the field. Some people thought I was nuts, but it's fine. And one of the first things we noticed was that east-facing plants received much earlier insect visits compared to west-facing plants. And when we compared this to temperature, it was east-facing plants were much warmer. It makes sense, they're facing the rising sun. So we artificially heated a west-facing plant, and we again received an increase in pollinator visits, suggesting that temperature really is coordinating this relationship between plant and pollinator. So the next question becomes, okay, so do these early morning temperatures affect how the flowers and the seeds actually develop? Egile Duvenau gave a very nice write-up in the Landbouw Weekblad on some of this work, so if you'd like to get a less sciencey version of it, you can read that as well. So the first thing we did was count seeds, measure heads, and my intern at Davis, Sana Saeed, did a great job. And one of the things we saw, there were a few things we saw. East-facing plants had bigger heads, they had heavier seed and bigger seed. Heavier, bigger go together. So it indicates that this easterly orientation is what's helping to maintain the plant's production and development of seeds and giving it a female fitness advantage. So we also wondered, does this temperature impact the actual pollination, how well a plant can get pollinated or send its pollen out to other plants? And so our collaborators at University of California, Berkeley, did this really nice study. What they did is they had cytoplasmic male sterile lines, so those are your female flowers, in the center facing all directions. They then had male plants or pollen-producing plants, which they set around these plants either in an east or a west-facing direction, and they allowed them to pollinate. They then harvested the seed, and they did paternity testing to see who was the dad at the end of the day. And one of the things they saw was that in almost all cases, the east-facing plants produced more offspring than the west-facing plants. So east-facing plants are better pollinators at the end of the day. So how is temperature actually influencing this pollination? Is it actually causing the pollen to emerge earlier? So I went back into my field and I photographed plants every 15 minutes on east and west heated plants, and then I counted the number of florets with pollen in every photograph. And what we saw was that if you look at the red and the yellow, that's the east and the west heated, they had much earlier pollen presentation. So the pollen was coming out earlier in the day, likely due to the temperature change. So how would that work? How does a sunflower actually present its pollen? So we're talking about this process of flowering. I don't know if you can see it too well in the video, but that coordinated pollen emergence. How is temperature regulating that? And for that, we need to talk a little bit about how a floret works inside. So you start at the beginning. At night, the buds will swell, and then they open, and the pollen emergence. What's actually happening is you have the anther filaments elongating, and this anther tube pushes out the top of the floret, and the pollen gets formed inside that tube. While that's happening, the female part grows up through the tube, pushing the pollen out the top, kind of like a plunger mechanism. And then only the next day will the female parts, the stigma, open up and is receptive to receiving pollen. And so we wondered if this process was actually being governed by temperature. So I went back into the field and I harvested florets and dissected them and measured about 5 styles every 15 minutes on heated, unheated, and east and west facing plants. And again, you can see that the heated and the east facing plants, which are warmer, had faster style elongation. I replicated this in a chamber experiment, so all things remained equal except for temperature. And again, we saw this rapid style elongation and earlier pollen presentation, shown in the red there. So then I moved back to South Africa, and I had this question. So if temperature's regulating style elongation, pollen presentation, and pollinator visits, what happens under extreme temperatures, or if we get a heat wave? How is that going to affect pollination? So my first MSc student, Uya, she went into the field. We grew plants in the field, this time all facing east. They're all normal growing in the field plants. But we did artificially heat a subset of these to about 10 degrees above what the normal temperature of the day was. So pretty extreme temperature change. And again, we saw earlier pollen presentation. She also looked at fertility of the pollen, and the pollen decreased in fertility as the heating continued. And we also looked at how the ability of the flowers to receive pollen, the stigma receptivity. And we found that as heating continued, the plants lost their ability to receive the pollen as well. Interestingly, she didn't see a change in pollinator visits between the heated and unheated. And we think the reason for this is because of the visual cues that pollinators get. So pollinators also use visual cues to identify their plants. And the east-facing plants look quite different to the west-facing plants. And sunflowers have UV guides on their petals to guide the insects to the center of their flowers. And you can see in a west-facing plant, those are much more east-facing plant, those are much more visible. And so that's probably the difference we were seeing there. So while she was working in the field, I know most people don't like this, but we were very excited that there was a heat wave, a natural heat wave, where we could assess how this process was happening naturally. And so we measured pollen timing, and again, it came out really fast. All the pollen was on the head within half an hour from the start of the day, compared to just a regular sunny day. We also saw, again, your loss in fertility as the day wore on in the pollen. And this time, we actually did see a difference in insect visits, where insects visited the plants earlier in the day. This actually makes sense because insects, when there's a heat wave, they get moving earlier because they don't want to be out in the hottest part of the day either. And so this suggests that what we've seen is that sunflower has the ability to shift the timing of its pollen presentation to avoid pollen being exposed to detrimental high heat during the day, and to align it with the earlier insect visits and insect movements. And that's quite an interesting evolutionary trait and something we can think about in the future. So this heat wave was actually pretty lucrative for my lab. So I spoke about Fraser and her planting day trial. Can't really see it here. But her planting day trial was in the field when we received the same heat wave. And the one set of plants, the January planting date, they were about 4 weeks old when this heat wave hit. And they got really badly damaged. They had scorched leaves. They didn't grow very well. When she measured the growth over time, the green line is that January planting date. And you see they were very, very slow, even compared to a very, very late March planting date. They really underperformed. So we were expecting them to produce poor yield and produce poor flower development. We're a flower lab, so she also measured floral traits. And we noticed an interesting thing. These heat wave stressed plants, when they were 4 weeks old, at flowering, they actually had a higher stigma receptivity compared to any of the other planting dates. That means they were able to receive pollen better than the other planting dates. And then when Fraser did her counts on her seed traits, we saw a correlation with this, where the very stressed January plants had far fewer unfilled seeds compared to the other planting dates. So they were better pollinated. And so then it limited how much they lost in terms of yield compared to the other planting dates, even though they were so stressed when they were young. And so we're quite excited about this finding, and we've been working to follow it up. So my honors student from last year, Stian Odendahl, he did the same experiment in a chamber where everything was kept equal except that we heat stressed the plants at 4 weeks old, and we again got that elevated stigma receptivity. And this year, Jessica Berry, my new honors student, she's sitting over here, she's going to be looking at when this heat needs to be applied and what other floral traits might be enhanced by this temperature change. And so that's the basic story I'm here to tell you today, is flower head orientation regulates microclimate to time pollen emergence and pollinator visits. Temperature regulates style elongation, influencing the timing of pollen emergence. And sunflowers avoid heat stress by altering floral traits and the timing of anthesis to maintain pollination. And this is important because it shows some aspects of why sunflower is hardy and also indicates some interesting traits we could consider breeding for in the future. And with that, there's always a huge village of people to thank, so this work never gets done in isolation. So thanks to our international and national collaborators and our funders, without whom this work can't be done. Thank you.